Marcus Thompson stood in front of his bathroom mirror, loosening his tie after a grueling 14-hour day of back-to-back meetings. His reflection showed a man who had earned every bit of his success, even though many didn't know his face. At 42, he had built Tech Fusion from a small startup in his garage into a multi-billion-dollar empire. 3 months ago, he had quietly purchased majority shares in Sky Atlantic Airlines, making him the owner of one of the country's largest air carriers. Running his hands over his face, Marcus decided to change into something more comfortable for his flight home. He slipped out of his designer suit and into a pair of worn jeans, his favorite old Stamford hoodie, and comfortable sneakers. His personal assistant, James, had often suggested he dress more appropriately for his position, but Marcus believed true power wasn't about appearance. "Your flight is in 2 hours, sir," James reminded him through the hotel room door. "Should I call the VIP escort service?" "No need," Marcus called back, packing his laptop into his backpack. "I want to fly normal today, just like everyone else." At Denver International Airport, Marcus breezed through security like any other passenger. No one recognized him, which was exactly how he liked it. He had purposely booked a late-night flight, knowing it would be quieter. As he walked toward Gate C-23, he couldn't help but smile at the massive Sky Atlantic logo on the wall, his newest acquisition, though that fact wasn't public knowledge yet. The boarding area was half empty, with just a few tired travelers scattered across the seats. Marcus sat down, pulled out his phone, and began reviewing some confidential documents about upcoming changes he planned for the airline. He had big dreams for Sky Atlantic, starting with better treatment of both passengers and employees. When boarding began, Marcus waited patiently in line with the other first-class passengers. As he approached the gate, a young attendant barely glanced at his boarding pass before waving him through. On the jet bridge, he took a deep breath, enjoying these moments of anonymity. Sarah Miller had been a flight attendant for 15 years, and she prided herself on running a tight ship in first class. Her perfectly pressed uniform and stern expression reflected her no-nonsense approach to her job. As passengers began boarding Flight SA-347 to San Francisco, she stood at attention, surveying each person who entered her cabin with a critical eye. When Marcus stepped into the plane, Sarah's expression immediately shifted. Her eyes narrowed at his casual attire, taking in the worn hoodie and old sneakers. She watched as he moved confidently toward seat 2A in first class, and her jaw tightened. In her experience, people who belonged in first class dressed the part. Marcus settled into his seat, placing his backpack under the chair in front of him. He was looking forward to a quiet flight where he could finalize the documents for tomorrow's big announcement, his public revelation as the airline's new owner. Just as he was pulling out his laptop, he felt a presence beside him. "Excuse me, sir." Sarah's voice carried that special tone flight attendants reserve for difficult situations. "I believe you may be in the wrong cabin. Let me check your boarding pass." Marcus looked up, meeting her gaze calmly. "No mistake, this is my seat." Sarah's perfectly penciled eyebrows rose slightly. "Sir, this is the first-class cabin. Your boarding pass, please." With practiced patience, Marcus reached into his pocket and produced his ticket. Sarah examined it with obvious skepticism, her lips pursing when she found everything in order. But rather than apologize, she simply handed it back with a tight smile. "Very well," she said, her tone making it clear she wasn't convinced he belonged there. "Please let me know if you need anything." As Sarah walked away, Marcus noticed several other first-class passengers watching the interaction. Some wore expressions of amusement, others of discomfort. A well-dressed older man across the aisle gave Marcus a sympathetic look, clearly having witnessed similar situations before. Marcus turned back to his laptop, pushing the incident from his mind. He had more important things to focus on, like the major changes he planned to implement in the airline's customer service training program. Changes that, ironically, would address exactly the kind of prejudiced behavior he had just experienced. Little did Sarah know that her next few interactions with this unassuming passenger in the hoodie would not only change the course of her career, but would also become a viral sensation and a turning point for airline industry standards across the country. For now, though, she simply continued her pre-flight checks, unaware that she was about to learn one of the most important lessons of her life. The plane was still boarding when Sarah returned to Marcus's seat, this time carrying a stack of magazines. She placed them on his tray table with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable browsing these while we complete boarding," she suggested, her tone overly sweet. "The gentleman in 2B is a CEO, and he'll need space to work on important business matters." Marcus looked at the magazines, then at his open laptop displaying confidential airline acquisition documents. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Thank you," he said calmly, "but I have my own work to complete." Sarah lingered, her presence becoming increasingly uncomfortable. "Sir, first-class passengers often conduct sensitive business. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings." Her emphasis on the word misunderstandings made her meaning clear. She still didn't believe he belonged there. A few rows back, another flight attendant, Jenny Chen, watched the interaction with growing concern. In her 5 years at Sky Atlantic, she had never seen Sarah act this way. Something about this passenger seemed to bother Sarah on a personal level. As more first-class passengers boarded, Sarah's behavior became increasingly obvious. She offered champagne to everyone except Marcus. When serving hot towels, she mysteriously ran out, just before reaching his seat. Each time she passed by, she made a show of checking overhead bins near him, as if expecting to find something out of place. Marcus maintained his composure, though his jaw tightened slightly with each interaction. He had experienced this kind of treatment before, in the early days of his success. It was one of the reasons he had wanted to buy an airline, to change the culture from the top down. "Excuse me," Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts again. "Sir, I need to verify your seat assignment one more time." The well-dressed man across the aisle finally spoke up. "Sarah, is this really necessary? You've checked his ticket twice already." Sarah straightened her back. "Mr. Davidson, I'm simply following protocol for passenger safety." "Protocol?" Mr. Davidson raised an eyebrow. "I've flown first class with Sky Atlantic over 200 times, and I've never had my ticket checked 3 times. Other passengers began to notice the situation. A woman in row 3 lowered her book, watching with disapproval. A young executive in row 1 had stopped his phone conversation to observe the scene unfolding behind him. Marcus closed his laptop slowly. "Miss Miller," he said, reading her name tag, "I understand you're trying to do your job, but I'm trying to do mine as well. Could we move past this?" Sarah's face flushed at his use of her name. "And what exactly is your job, sir?" The question came out more like an accusation. Before Marcus could respond, Jenny approached with the drink cart. "Sarah, we need to complete the pre-flight service," she said quietly, trying to defuse the situation. But Sarah wasn't finished. She pointed to Marcus's backpack under the seat. "Sir, that bag seems quite large. We'll need to check its dimensions." Marcus had enough. "The bag contains my laptop and confidential documents. It meets all airline specifications. I checked before boarding." "How would you know airline specifications?" Sarah challenged, her voice rising slightly. A tense silence fell over the first-class cabin. Several passengers had their phones out now, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Jenny tried once more to intervene. "Sarah, please, everything is in order. Let's continue with our service." But Sarah was too far gone, too invested in proving she was right. She reached for Marcus's laptop, saying, "Sir, if you're going to be difficult, I'll need to see some additional identification." Marcus moved his laptop away from her reach. "Miss Miller, I'm asking you professionally to stop this harassment. I have a right to be here, and I have a right to work in peace." The word harassment seemed to trigger something in Sarah. Her face turned red, her hands trembled slightly, and in that moment, all her years of professional training seemed to evaporate. What happened next would soon become viral footage on every social media platform across the globe. Sarah Miller, a 15-year veteran of Sky Atlantic Airlines, was about to make the biggest mistake of her career, one that would not only change her life but would spark a national conversation about prejudice, privilege, and the power of assumption. As Marcus turned back to his laptop, Sarah's hand was already in motion, driven by frustration, bias, and a complete misreading of the situation. The sound of the slap would echo through the cabin, marking the point of no return for everyone involved. The sound of the slap echoed through the first-class cabin like a thunderclap. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Passengers froze with their phones raised, Flight attendants stood with their mouths open, and even the ambient noise of the aircraft seemed to dim. Marcus slowly raised his hand to his cheek, where a red mark was already forming. His eyes, which had been patient and calm throughout all the previous harassment, now darkened with a controlled anger that made the temperature in the cabin seem to drop several degrees. Sarah stood there, her hands still raised, as the reality of what she had just done crashed over her like a wave. Her face went from red to pale in seconds. 15 years of professional training, countless flights, thousands of passengers, and she had just committed the most serious violation of airline policy possible, physically assaulting a passenger. "Oh my God," Jenny whispered from behind the drink cart, breaking the silence. The spell of stillness broke. Phones started clicking frantically. Several passengers began speaking at once. "Did you see that? I got it all on video. Someone call the police. This is outrageous." Marcus stood up slowly, drawing himself to his full height. Even in his casual hoodie and jeans, something about his presence now commanded attention. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried throughout the cabin with absolute authority. "Ms. Miller," he said, each word carefully measured, "you have just assaulted a passenger on this aircraft." Sarah's hand finally dropped to her side. I didn't mean to. You weren't cooperating." Marcus reached into his backpack and pulled out his phone. The movement caused Sarah to step back, but he simply pressed a single number on his speed dial and put the phone to his ear. "James, get me Robert Chen on the line immediately." He paused. "Yes, the Chief of Operations. Now." Sarah's face, already pale, turned almost gray. The Chief of Operations? How did this man in a hoodie have the private number of Sky Atlantic's senior executive? The answer came moments later as Marcus's voice cut through the murmuring cabin. "Robert? This is Marcus Thompson. Yes, the owner. We have a situation on flight SA 347. The word owner hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her knees weakened, and she had to grab the nearest seat to steady herself. Jenny quickly moved to her side. Whether to support her or prevent her from falling, no one was sure. "Yes," Marcus continued into the phone, "I was just physically assaulted by one of your flight attendants, Sarah Miller. She's been harassing me since boarding, apparently because my casual attire didn't meet her standards for first class." Mr. Davidson, the businessman across the aisle who had tried to intervene earlier, stood up. "Sir, I witnessed everything. Her behavior was completely unprofessional from the start." Other passengers joined in, offering their recordings as evidence. The young executive from row 1 was already uploading his video to social media. Within minutes, #SkyAtlanticSlap would start trending across multiple platforms. The head purser, alerted by the commotion, rushed to the first-class cabin. One look at the scene. Marcus Thompson on the phone, Sarah trembling against the seat, passengers recording everything, and he knew this was a career-ending situation. "Mr. Thompson, sir," the head purser said, "I apologize deeply for this incident. We'll have Ms. Miller removed from the flight immediately." Sarah's legs finally gave out, and she sank into an empty seat. "I didn't know. I never thought," she mumbled, tears starting to roll down her cheeks. Marcus finished his phone call and turned to address the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disruption. I am Marcus Thompson, the new owner of Sky Atlantic Airlines. This incident, while regrettable, will be handled appropriately." The revelation sent another wave of murmurs through the cabin. Several passengers who had been judgmental of Marcus earlier now looked mortified, realizing they too had made assumptions based on his appearance. As airport security arrived to escort Sarah off the plane, Marcus sat back down, his cheeks still stinging. He opened his laptop again, but this time to a new document. The title at the top read, "Sky Atlantic Airlines, Comprehensive Anti-Bias Training Program, Draft 1. The incident was over, but its repercussions were just beginning. Within hours, this story would explode across social media and news channels, forcing America to once again confront its assumptions about success, appearance, and privilege. Within 30 minutes of the incident, the entire airport was buzzing with activity. Security officers escorted Sarah through the terminal, her once perfect uniform now wrinkled, her face streaked with tears. Behind her, a replacement flight attendant hurried to take her position on the plane. In the first-class cabin, passengers were still processing what they had witnessed. Mr. Davidson, the frequent flyer who had tried to intervene earlier, approached Marcus with an extended hand. "Mr. Thompson, I'm James Davidson from Goldman Sachs. I had no idea you were the one who bought Sky Atlantic." The acquisition was brilliantly quiet. Marcus shook his hand, the red mark on his cheek now fully visible under the cabin lights. "That was the plan, Mr. Davidson. We wanted to make changes from the inside before making any public announcements." Other passengers began sharing their videos in a group chat someone had created. The clips showed everything: Sarah's repeated harassment, her aggressive behavior, the shocking slap, and Marcus's revelation. Within the hour, these videos would begin their viral spread across the internet. In the airport security office, Sarah sat in a small room, her hands shaking as she filled out an incident report. Through the window, she could see airport police officers talking to airline officials. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from coworkers who had already heard about what happened. Back on the plane, Robert Chen, the chief of operations, had arrived personally to handle the situation. He rushed down the jet bridge, his face showing the strain of a man who knew a PR crisis was about to explode. "Marcus," he said, forgetting formal titles in his haste, "the media is already asking for comments. Someone leaked your ownership of the airline. The story is spreading fast." Marcus nodded, unsurprised. He turned to the other passengers in first class. "I apologize again for this disruption. I know many of you have connections to make." A young woman in row 3 spoke up. "Mr. Thompson, don't apologize. What happened to you was wrong. My mother is black, and she faces this kind of prejudice all the time, though usually not so violent." The cabin grew quiet as passengers reflected on their own biases. Several who had initially judged Marcus by his casual clothes now looked uncomfortable. Robert Chen cleared his throat. "We can have another aircraft brought around if you prefer not to fly on this one, sir." Marcus shook his head. "No, these passengers have schedules to keep. But I do want to say something to everyone here." He stood up, addressing the entire first-class cabin. "What happened today was unfortunate, but it's also an opportunity. Every person in this cabin witnessed how quick judgments and biases can lead to serious mistakes. As the owner of Sky Atlantic, I promise you this incident will lead to real change." Jenny, who had remained on the flight, stepped forward nervously. "Mr. Thompson, I want to apologize on behalf of the crew. I should have done more to stop Sarah's behavior." Marcus turned to her with a kind smile. "You tried to intervene, Jenny. That's exactly the kind of awareness we need more of in this industry." Meanwhile, in the terminal, the story was spreading like wildfire. Gate agents were showing each other viral tweets about the incident. #BlackBillionaire and #SkyAtlanticSlap were trending nationwide. News vans were already pulling up outside the airport. Sarah, still in the security office, watched through a window as her 15-year career crumbled around her. On a small TV in the corner, she saw her own face appearing on local news, followed by a business photo of Marcus Thompson. The caption read, "Flight attendant assaults tech billionaire owner of Sky Atlantic Airlines." Back in the first-class cabin, Marcus opened his laptop once again. Instead of working on acquisition documents, he began typing a new memo to all Sky Atlantic employees. The subject line read, "Creating a culture of respect. Our path forward." As the replacement crew completed their preparations for takeoff, passengers throughout the plane were sharing the story on social media. Many included personal reflections about times they had judged others based on appearance. The incident was transforming from a simple assault into something larger, a mirror reflecting society's ongoing struggles with prejudice and perception. And at the center of it all sat Marcus Thompson, the billionaire in a hoodie, calmly typing out his vision for turning this crisis into an opportunity for lasting change. By midnight, the videos of the incident had gone viral across every major social media platform. Sarah Miller's slap had been viewed over 10 million times, and the number kept growing. News vans crowded the airport parking lot, their bright lights illuminating the night sky as reporters delivered live updates. Inside her small apartment, Sarah sat on her couch, staring at her TV in horror. Her face was everywhere, on news channels, social media, and even international websites. The headlines were brutal. "Flight attendant assaults Black billionaire owner." "Sky Atlantic in crisis. Racism at 30,000 feet." Tech mogul Marcus Thompson reveals airline ownership after attack. Her phone had been ringing nonstop. Friends, family, and even old colleagues were trying to reach her. She had turned it off after the 100th call. Her sister Jane sat beside her, offering silent support as they watched the story unfold. "I've ruined everything," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. 15 years of perfect service, gone in one moment of stupidity. At Sky Atlantic's headquarters, the crisis management team had been assembled in the main conference room. Robert Chen stood at the front, addressing a room full of tired executives. "The video has reached 50 million views across platforms," he reported, pointing to a screen showing various social media metrics. "We're trending worldwide, and not in a good way." One of the marketing executives raised her hand. "Mr. Thompson's office just sent over his draft statement. You need to see this." The room fell silent as they read Marcus's words on the screen. Instead of the expected angry response or calls for immediate firing, his statement was thoughtful and measured. "What happened today on Flight SA 347 reflects a larger problem in our society. While the actions of one employee were unacceptable, this incident presents an opportunity for real change. Sky Atlantic will use this moment to transform our corporate culture and set new standards for diversity and inclusion in the airline industry." Across town, in his penthouse office, Marcus sat with his personal assistant James, reviewing the flood of media requests. "The morning show's all want interviews," James said, scrolling through his tablet. "CNN, Fox, MSNBC, they're all calling. Even international networks are interested." Marcus looked out at the city lights below. "Schedule a press conference for tomorrow morning. But first, I want to meet with Sarah Miller." James looked up in surprise. "Sir? Are you sure that's wise? The legal team strongly advises against any personal contact." "Sometimes wisdom and legal advice don't align," Marcus replied, touching his cheek where the SLAPS mark had faded to a slight redness. "Book a private conference room at the Marriott. No press, no cameras." Meanwhile, social media had turned into a battlefield of opposing viewpoints. Some users demanded Sarah's immediate arrest and prosecution. Others shared their own stories of facing prejudice while being successful. Hashtags multiplied. Hashtag I am Marcus Thompson. Hashtag Sky Atlantic boycott. Hashtag bias in America. Hashtag Hootie and successful. Sarah's old Facebook photos began circulating, with people analyzing her past posts and pictures for signs of prejudice. Her previously private life was becoming public property, dissected by strangers who had never met her. At the airport, the flight had finally departed, 3 hours behind schedule. In first class, passengers were still discussing the incident. Jenny, the flight attendant who had tried to intervene, provided impeccable service while fielding constant questions from curious passengers. Mr. Davidson, the investment banker, was already drafting an email to his entire company about unconscious bias, using today's events as a teaching moment. The young woman with the black mother had posted a thoughtful video about her own experiences with prejudice, which was quickly gaining traction online. Back in her apartment, Sarah finally turned her phone back on. Among the hundreds of notifications, one message stood out. It was from Sky Atlantic's HR department. "Ms. Miller, Mr. Marcus Thompson has requested a private meeting with you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. This is not a disciplinary hearing. Please respond if you are willing to attend." Sarah stared at the message, her hands trembling. The man she had humiliated and assaulted wanted to meet with her. It wasn't a summons to be fired or a legal threat. It was a request. She looked at her sister, who had read the message over her shoulder. "What should I do?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jane squeezed her hand. "You go. Whatever happens next, you face it with dignity. It's the first step to making things right." The next morning, the Marriott Hotel's private conference room was ready for the meeting between Marcus and Sarah. Security guards stood at every entrance, keeping the growing crowd of reporters at bay. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching into the morning sky like metal trees. Sarah arrived early, dressed in a simple black suit instead of her flight attendant uniform. Her sister Jane had driven her to avoid the media frenzy. As they pulled into the underground parking garage, Sarah's hands wouldn't stop shaking. "Remember," Jane said, squeezing her sister's hand, "he asked for this meeting." That has to mean something. Inside the hotel, Marcus sat with his team, reviewing the morning's headlines. The story had exploded overnight. Black billionaire's response to assault shocks nation. Sky Atlantic stock drops 15% after viral incident. Social media divided over airline assault. His phone buzzed with a message from James. Sarah Miller has arrived. Marcus stood up, straightening his jacket. Today, he wore a proper business suit, though he smiled slightly remembering yesterday's hoodie. "Give us the room," he said to his team. "All of you." Robert Chen protested. "Sir, the lawyers strongly advise." "This isn't about legal advice," Marcus cut in. "This is about human dignity, both hers and mine." Outside the conference room, protesters had gathered on the street. Some held signs supporting Sarah, calling for understanding and second chances. Others demanded her arrest and prosecution. Police officers formed a line between the two groups, maintaining order. Social media was having its own war. Video clips from the flight kept surfacing, each showing different angles of the incident. Body language experts appeared on morning shows, analyzing Sarah's actions and Marcus's response. Corporate leaders posted lengthy statements about their own diversity initiatives. Inside the conference room, Sarah stood as Marcus entered. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying and lack of sleep. She had prepared a speech, but the words stuck in her throat when she saw him. Marcus spoke first, his voice calm and measured. "Please sit down, Ms. Miller." They sat across from each other at the large conference table. Through the windows, camera flashes occasionally lit up the room as photographers tried to capture any glimpse of the meeting. "I'm so sorry," Sarah finally managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what came over me. In 15 years, I've never." Marcus raised his hand gently, stopping her. "Ms. Miller, I didn't ask you here for an apology. I asked you here because I want to understand." Sarah looked up, confused. "Understand?" "Yes, I want to understand what you saw when you looked at me yesterday. Not the owner of the airline, not the billionaire, but the black man in a hoodie sitting in first class. I want to understand why that image bothered you so much." Outside, the crowd had grown larger. News helicopters circled overhead, trying to get footage through the windows. On social media, #MarcusMeetSarah was trending worldwide. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. Sarah took a deep breath, tears forming in her eyes. I saw someone who didn't fit my image of first class, and instead of questioning that image, I questioned you. I'd spent all night thinking about it, about all the times I've made assumptions about passengers based on how they looked." Marcus nodded, encouraging her to continue. "My father was a flight attendant," she said, her voice stronger now. "He always said first class had standards, that we had to maintain those standards. But now I realize he meant service standards, not judging people by their appearance." As they talked, the world outside continued to spin with speculation. Stock markets reacted to every rumor about the meeting. Aviation industry experts debated the future of Sky Atlantic. Diversity consultants offered their services to airlines worldwide. In the hotel lobby, both Marcus's and Sarah's teams waited anxiously. Jane paced back and forth, checking her phone constantly for any news. Robert Chen stared at the stock market ticker, watching Sky Atlantic's shares continue to fall. But in the conference room, something unexpected was happening. Two people, divided by a moment of prejudice, were having an honest conversation about bias, perception, and the possibility of change. Marcus pulled out his laptop, opening a document. "Ms. Miller, I have a proposal for you, one that might surprise everyone waiting outside those doors." The press conference room at Sky Atlantic headquarters was packed with reporters. Camera lights blazed and microphones pointed forward like spears as Marcus Thompson stepped up to the podium. The red mark on his cheek had faded, but the videos of the slap were still playing on news channels worldwide. Behind him stood an unexpected group: Sarah Miller, Robert Chen, and a team of diversity consultants. Sarah looked nervous but determined in her Sky Atlantic uniform, which surprised many who expected her to have been fired. Marcus adjusted the microphone and looked out at the sea of eager faces. "Good afternoon. 2 days ago, an incident occurred on one of our flights that has sparked a national conversation about bias and prejudice. Today, We're here to announce how Sky Atlantic will turn that incident into an opportunity for real change. Cameras clicked rapidly as reporters leaned forward. Everyone had expected either a lawsuit announcement or a public firing. This seemed different. Ms. Sarah Miller's actions were wrong, Marcus continued, and she has acknowledged that. But firing her would be the easy way out. Instead, we're taking a harder but more meaningful path. He gestured for Sarah to join him at the podium. She stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she faced the cameras. Yesterday, Ms. Miller and I had a long conversation about bias, both conscious and unconscious. We talked about how quick judgments and assumptions can lead to harmful actions. But most importantly, we talked about how to prevent this from happening again. In the audience, reporters typed frantically on their laptops. Social media was exploding with live reactions to the unexpected turn of events. Marcus unveiled a large presentation screen behind him. Today, Sky Atlantic is launching the most comprehensive anti-bias training program in airline history. We're investing $50 million in creating the Center for Inclusive Travel, a new division dedicated to transforming how airlines approach diversity and customer service. The room buzzed with surprise. This was far bigger than anyone had anticipated. And, Marcus continued, Ms. Miller will be an integral part of this program. Sarah stepped closer to the microphone, her voice steady despite her nerves. My actions that day came from biases I didn't even realize I had. Mr. Thompson has given me a chance to turn my mistake into a teaching moment. Instead of being fired, I'll be working with the new training program, sharing my story as a warning and a lesson about the consequences of unchecked bias. The reporters erupted with questions. Mr. Thompson, why not press charges? Ms. Miller, how can you help prevent bias when you showed it yourself? Is this just a PR move? Marcus raised his hand for quiet. This isn't about PR. It's about real change. Every employee in our company, from pilots to ground crew, will go through this new training program. Ms. Miller's experience will be a powerful teaching tool precisely because she lived it. Robert Chen stepped forward to explain the details of the program. It would include virtual reality simulations, role-playing exercises, and real-world scenarios. Airlines worldwide could license the program for their own staff. In the back of the room, Jenny, the flight attendant who had tried to intervene during the incident, watched with tears in her eyes. She had been promoted to lead the flight crew training segment of the new program. Sarah's sister Jane, sitting in the front row, beamed with pride. Her sister was turning the worst mistake of her life into something positive. As the presentation continued, social media reaction shifted. #SecondChances and #RealChange started trending alongside the older angry hashtags. Many praised Marcus's innovative approach to addressing bias in the service industry. Marcus concluded the press conference with a personal statement. I could have responded to hate with hate, to bias with punishment. Instead, we're choosing education over retribution, understanding over anger. This is how real change happens, not by ending careers, but by transforming minds. After the press conference, Sarah approached Marcus privately. Thank you for believing in redemption, she said quietly. Marcus smiled. Sometimes the best way to fight darkness is to turn on a light. Now, we have work to do. As they walked out together, followed by flashing cameras and shouting reporters, both knew that this was just the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead. Turning a viral moment of shame into a lasting movement for change in an industry that touched millions of lives every day. 1 year later, Marcus Thompson stood in the newly built Center for Inclusive Travel, watching as another group of airline employees graduated from the training program. The large ceremony hall was filled with staff from various airlines around the world, all wearing their different uniforms but sharing the same proud expressions. At the podium, Sarah Miller was giving the closing speech. She looked different now. More confident, more purposeful. The past year had transformed her from a symbol of prejudice into a powerful advocate for change. When I slapped Mr. Thompson that day, she said to the quiet room, I thought I was losing everything. My career, my reputation, my future. Instead, I was given a chance to be part of something bigger than myself. The audience included many familiar faces. Jenny Chen, now the head of flight crew training, sat in the front row. Mr. Davidson from the original flight had become a regular guest speaker, sharing his own journey of recognizing and addressing unconscious bias. Marcus smiled as he remembered how far they'd come. Sky Atlantic's training program had become the gold standard in the airline industry. Over 50,000 employees from various airlines had completed the course, and the numbers kept growing. The viral video that had once brought shame now played at the beginning of every training session, not to humiliate, but to show how a moment of bias could lead to transformation. Sarah's slap had become a wake-up call for an entire industry. Today, Sarah continued, "We celebrate not just your completion of this program, but your commitment to making air travel more inclusive for everyone. Remember, it's not about what you wear or how you look. It's about treating every person with dignity and respect." In the audience, a young flight attendant wiped away tears. Just last week, she had caught herself making assumptions about a passenger based on their appearance. The training had helped her recognize and correct her bias before it led to harmful actions. After the ceremony, Marcus and Sarah walked through the center's interactive exhibits. One wall displayed thousands of testimonials from employees and passengers sharing their experiences with bias and their journeys toward understanding. "Did you ever imagine this would be the result?" Sarah asked, gesturing at the bustling center around them. Marcus shook his head. "When I bought the airline, I wanted to change things from the inside, but I never expected it would happen quite like this." The center had become more than just a training facility. It was a research hub for studying and addressing bias in customer service. Universities sent students to study their methods. Other industries began adopting their training techniques. Sky Atlantic's stock had not only recovered but reached new highs. Their commitment to inclusive service had attracted more customers and earned loyalty from travelers who appreciated their approach. In the staff lounge, photos lined the walls showing the program's growth. The first small class of 20 had grown into an international movement. Sarah's story had been featured in business magazines and academic journals as a case study in transformative leadership and redemption. Marcus's phone buzzed with a message. Another airline wanted to implement the training program. This time from Asia, their influence was spreading globally. "Your next class starts in 10 minutes, his assistant reminded him. Since the incident, Marcus had made it a point to speak at every training session, sharing his perspective not as a billionaire airline owner, but as someone who had experienced bias firsthand. As they walked to the classroom, Sarah stopped by the wall where the original viral video played on a loop. "Some people still ask why you didn't fire me," she said quietly. Marcus looked at the video thoughtfully, "because firing you would have solved nothing. This," he gestured at the busy center around them, "this solves something." Together, they entered the classroom where a new group of trainees waited. The room fell silent as they recognized the two people whose confrontation had started this movement. Marcus took his place at the front of the room, while Sarah sat among the trainees. They had learned that true change happened not from the top down, but from within, one person, one conversation, one moment of understanding at a time. "Welcome," Marcus began, "to the Center for Inclusive Travel. Today, you'll learn how one moment of bias can either destroy relationships or transform them. The choice is yours. Our story shows that even the worst moments can lead to the best changes, if we're brave enough to learn from them."